Tonight, we are going to find out why the most beautiful woman in ancient Greece woke up every morning and drew a single thick line of dark pigment across her face, connecting both eyebrows into one continuous, unbroken stripe. Not to hide something, not by accident, not despite wanting to look beautiful, because that was what beautiful looked like. And before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a strange and wonderful thing to see someone tuning in at 3 in the morning from a city I've never visited. Now settle in, because tonight we are going back roughly 2,500 years to a world where beauty was not a matter of personal taste, where your face was read like a document, and where the rules about what counted as attractive were so specific, so thoroughly reasoned, and so completely unlike anything we assume today that understanding them requires you to throw out almost everything modern culture has told you about what beauty is and what it is for. We are starting with the unibrow, but we are not staying there, because the unibrow, strange as it seems, is actually the most straightforward thing on this list. Imagine you are a woman living in Athens, sometime in the 5th century BCE. You wake before sunrise. The city is already stirring outside. You can hear it, the distant sound of the market beginning, the first carts on the stone streets, but you are not going to the market. That is not how your day works. Your day begins, as it always begins, in the women's quarters of your household, and the room at the back of the house that was designed specifically to keep you away from the public world outside. You sit down at your bronze mirror, a disc of polished metal, not glass, that returns your face to you in a slightly flattened, slightly golden version of itself, and you begin the work. The first thing you reach for is the white lead, ground to a fine powder, mixed with a little water, applied carefully to your face, your neck, the visible portions of your arms and chest. A smooth, even pale surface covering whatever your natural skin looks like underneath. Then the kohl. Dark, ground fine, applied with a small brush or stick to your brows, and not just to define them, but to extend them, to connect them, to draw a single unbroken line from one side of your face to the other, meeting without a gap above your nose. Then the red. Mulberry juice or alkanet root, pressed into your lips and worked into your cheeks. A deliberate, applied redness against the whitened skin. You have been doing this every day since you were old enough to understand that appearing in public without it was appearing in public as someone who had not bothered to make themselves presentable. Modern women spend a not insignificant amount of time and money trying to look as though they are not wearing any makeup. You were doing the opposite. Applying a face that was unmistakably, visibly constructed, and that was beautiful precisely because of that. The world outside does not necessarily know your name, but it can read your face. And what your face says, in the visual language your culture has given everyone around you, is, this woman is properly maintained, this woman's husband keeps her indoors, this woman has access to the materials required to meet the standard, this woman is, in the word your culture reaches for automatically when it wants to say both beautiful and good at the same time. Kalos. That word is where we need to start, because you cannot understand a single thing about Greek beauty standards. The unibrow. The white lead, the proportions, the gymnasium. What happened to people who didn't meet the standard, without understanding what the ancient Greeks actually believed beauty was, and what they believed is so different from what we believe that hearing it plainly stated feels like a mistranslation. Here is what they believed. Beauty and goodness are the same thing, not associated, not linked. Not the way we might casually say someone has a beautiful personality, using the word loosely for something we actually mean in a different register. The same thing. The ancient Greeks had a phrase, kalos kagathos, beautiful and good. It appears in Plato, in Aristotle, in Xenophon, in Thucydides, in virtually every major Greek writer across the classical period, and the translators who have worked on these texts for centuries tend to reach for something vague in English, noble and good, fine and good, because the literal meaning is uncomfortable to put plainly. The literal meaning is this: if you are truly beautiful, you are truly virtuous. If you are truly virtuous, you are, in some essential and visible way, beautiful. The outer surface, the face, the body, the way you hold yourself, the way you move, is a legible text in which your moral character is written. Anyone who knows how to read it can see who you are inside. Now understand the reverse. Physical ugliness in this framework was not just unfortunate, it was not just the absence of a pleasant feature. It was moral deficiency made visible, a flaw in the surface that reflected a flaw inside, not a metaphor, not a cultural association that thoughtful people tried to look past, a direct reading of a real quality. The way you read a crack in a piece of pottery and understand that the clay was imperfect. This was not a French position. This was not one philosopher's eccentric opinion that his colleagues disputed over dinner. This was the operating system. And once you understand it, everything else about Greek beauty culture, every specific standard, every practice, every terrifying consequence for the people who didn't meet it, makes a strange, cold, internal sense. Modern people spend considerable energy trying to teach themselves and their children that beauty is subjective, that it comes in many forms, that what's inside is what really matters. The ancient Greeks looked at that sentiment and considered it philosophically naive. They had already worked out what was inside. It was on the face. Anyone could see it. Before we go further, we need to address the most significant complication in the entire kalos kagathos framework: Socrates. Socrates was, by the unanimous account of everyone who wrote about him, physically ugly, not slightly unattractive. Not the kind of face that grows on you. Profoundly, unmistakably, uncomfortably ugly by every Greek standard that existed. A flat, wide nose, the specific shape that Greek aesthetic theory associated with the coarse and the undiscriminating. Bulging eyes his contemporaries compared to a crab's. A protruding belly, thick lips, short, a rolling odd gait that his enemies called the swagger. By the kalos kagathos principle, applied with any consistency, this man was morally deficient. Don't trust him. Don't give him influence over your children. Don't listen to him more than necessary. And yet by the time of his trial in 3099 BCE, Socrates was the most influential philosophical voice in Athens, the man whose conversations had shaped an entire generation of Athenian aristocrats, the man the oracle at Delphi had reportedly called the wisest person alive. The system could not process this. It had no category for a profoundly ugly man who was also genuinely virtuous. So Plato built one. In the Symposium and the Phaedrus across the body of his philosophical work, Plato developed the argument that there was a beauty of the soul, a real beauty, more real than physical beauty, of which physical beauty was only an imperfect reflection. Socrates, ugly on the outside, was beautiful in the deepest and most important sense, the beauty of the soul visible to philosophy even when it was invisible to the eyes. This is one of the most consequential moves in the history of Western philosophy, and it was made necessary by one ugly man who refused to behave like his face said he should. But notice what did not change. The equation of beauty and goodness was not abandoned. It was expanded inward. The belief did not weaken, it went deeper. And the specific beauty standards of the physical world, for faces, for bodies, for skin, for hair, for smell, continued to operate on the original principle, which is where we are going next. Walk through any major museum with a collection of ancient Greek sculpture and look at the male figures, the athletes, the warriors, the gods. The Kouros figures, the standing male nudes that began appearing in the 7th century BCE, the earliest large-scale stone sculpture in the Greek tradition. They are smooth, defined, symmetrical, hairless mostly. The specific look that centuries of museum visits have trained us to think of as what the ancient Greeks found beautiful in a male body. Here is the thing, that is not what they found beautiful in a male body. Not in daily life, not in the social world where actual men lived and were assessed and found attractive or otherwise. The sculptures are the idealized body of religious and athletic contexts. They are what a body should look like in the specific, sacred setting of the games, or when representing a god. They are not the everyday standard. For the everyday standard, you need the written sources, and the written sources say something different. The first thing to understand is that male beauty was the primary subject of Greek beauty culture, not female beauty, male beauty. We live in a culture where the beauty industry, the cosmetics, the fashion, the diet, the fitness content organized around appearance rather than health, is overwhelmingly aimed at women. Modern beauty culture is built around the question of what women look like. Ancient Greek beauty culture was organized around the opposite question: what do men look like? The gymnasium, the central institution of Greek male social life, from which we get our word, was not a fitness center. It was a beauty institution as much as an athletic one. Greek men went every day. They exercised naked. They oiled their bodies before exercise, worked out, then scraped the oil and sweat off with a small curved metal tool called a strigil. They argued philosophy. They conducted business. They formed political alliances. And they assessed each other's bodies in a context where that assessment was entirely normal and entirely public. If someone in your office building did a naked circuit of the meeting rooms every morning while their colleagues evaluated their proportions, that would be, to put it mildly, a significant HR event. In Athens, it was Tuesday. Now, what were they actually assessing? The ideal male body in ancient Greece was not the smooth, lean body of the marble sculpture. It was larger. The Greeks associated genuine physical mass, the body of a man who had been eating well and training hard for years, with virtue, with status, with the specific kind of excellence they called arete. A thin man was a man who had not been eating well. A man who had not been eating well was either poor or ill. Poor or ill men were not able to participate in the athletic and military life that Greek culture required. Thinness was a marker of social failure, and social failure was, in the Kalos Kagathos framework, moral failure. The heroes of Greek epic poetry, Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus, Heracles, are all described as large, not just tall but genuinely substantial. Men who occupied space, men whose physical presence was itself a kind of argument. The opposite end of the scale was also unattractive, for a different reason. Excessive fatness was the body of a person without self-control. Self-control, sophrosyne, was one of the central Greek virtues. A person who ate to excess and showed it in their body was a person whose body was advertising a moral failure. The fat body was not the body of a person who had resources. It was the body of a person who had resources and no virtue, which was, in a Greek framework, considerably worse. The ideal was the body between those two poles, well-fed, well-exercised, well-maintained. Not thin, not soft, but the specific, full, trained, controlled physique that daily gymnasium attendance produced over years. Modern fitness culture sells this as an aspiration, a journey, something you post about. In ancient Athens, neglecting it was a moral failure visible to anyone who looked at you. In the 5th century BCE, a Greek sculptor named Polykleitos wrote a book. It was called the Canon. It doesn't survive. Like most of the written work of the ancient world, the original is lost. What survives is the sculpture he made to illustrate it, which was copied in marble so many times by Roman sculptors that multiple copies sit in museums today, and the references and later writers who had access to it. From those references and from the sculpture itself, scholars have reconstructed the argument. It was a system of mathematical proportions for the ideal human body, not guidelines, not preferences, a mathematical system, a set of ratios between specific measurements. The finger to the hand to the forearm to the upper arm, the arm to the height, continuing through the entire body, which Polykleitos argued produced, when all the ratios were correct, a body that was objectively beautiful. Not subjectively beautiful, objectively. The beauty was in the proportions. The proportions were mathematical. Mathematics was objective, therefore the beauty was objective. This is the Greek argument. Stated plainly, it sounds like something a particularly confident engineer might post online, and the comments section would be unpleasant. But in the context of ancient Greece, it was taken seriously by serious people for centuries. The face had its own subsystem. The ideal face was divided into 3 equal vertical zones: the forehead from hairline to brows, the nose from brows to its base, the lower face from the base of the nose to the chin, each zone equal in height. The width of the face had the cheekbones in specific ratio to its height, the width of the nose equal to the distance between the eyes, and the nose itself, straight. A line from between the brows to the tip that deviated as little as possible from vertical, not slightly curved, not upturned, straight. The straight nose appears in description after description of beautiful people in Greek literature. The sculptures confirm it. Idealized Greek noses are almost universally straight, sometimes to a degree that looks slightly artificial to modern eyes. The reason connects back to kalos kagathos. The straight nose was the nose of the Greeks, as opposed to the noses of non-Greek peoples. The mathematical system presented itself as universal, as the discovery of an objective truth about what a beautiful human body looks like. But the specific measurements it identified as ideal were the measurements of idealized Greek bodies. The objectivity was a story the Greeks told themselves, as most cultures, in most periods, tell themselves a story about the objectivity or naturalness of their own beauty standards. You have probably heard someone in your lifetime describe a certain look as just naturally attractive or objectively beautiful in a tone that suggests they have somehow risen above cultural influence. They have not, neither had the Greeks. They were simply more systematic about it. There is a question we have been dancing around since the bronze mirror at the start of this video, and it's time to ask it directly. What did all of this cost? Because a moral system that reads virtue directly off the body only works smoothly if everybody has equal access to the tools required to produce the right body. Ancient Athens did not have equal access to anything, let alone imported cosmetics, and the gap between who could afford to live virtuous and who could not was, itself, quietly written into the philosophy. Start with the white lead. Simithion, the Greeks called it lead carbonate, and while the base mineral itself wasn't especially rare, preparing it safely, refining it into a usable cosmetic paste, and combining it with the other ingredients a fashionable face required was a specialized labor-intensive process, typically the work of enslaved household staff trained specifically for the job. A wealthy household might have a dedicated attendant whose entire function was managing her mistress's cosmetic supply, grinding pigments, mixing bases, applying the finished product each morning in a routine that could take a significant portion of the early day. That is not a purchase, that is staffing. The red for cheeks and lips came from alkanet root, or crushed mulberries, both of which required either cultivation trade or seasonal availability, not catastrophic expenses individually but recurring ones, the ancient equivalent of a subscription rather than a one-time purchase. The eye pigments came from coal, frequently imported from Egypt, where the tradition of eye-darkening cosmetics was, if anything, older and more elaborate than the Greek version, and had been feeding trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean for centuries before Athens ever built a gymnasium. Perfume was its own separate economy entirely, and a considerably more expensive one. Fine scented oils, perfumed with iris rose, or the enormously prized cinnamon and myrrh imported from Arabia and beyond, could be extraordinarily costly, discussed by comic playwrights as a marker of genuinely serious wealth rather than ordinary upper-class comfort. There is a reason cheap gymnasium olive oil and luxury symposium perfume occupy completely different tiers in the sources. One was a civic expectation available to any citizen man with access to the gymnasium. The other was a status flex available only to the seriously rich. Now put this next to everything we've already told you about what beauty was supposed to mean. A poor Athenian citizen woman, free, respectable, married to a man of modest means, could not maintain the same pallor, the same elaborately maintained hair, the same imported perfume, ECs, the same daily refreshed cosmetic surface as the wife of a wealthy household, not because she didn't understand the standard, because she couldn't afford the raw materials required to meet it, and because meeting it required staff she didn't have. Under Kalos Kagathos, this had one inevitable, brutal implication. Her poverty wasn't just an economic condition, it became visible on her face as a moral one. The philosophy that told an Athenian audience the face reveals the soul did not pause to ask whether the face in question had been given equal materials to work with. It simply read the surface and rendered its verdict, and the verdict for a poor woman was the same verdict rendered on a poor man for being thin, not unlucky, deficient. Modern beauty culture gets criticized, correctly, for being expensive, an industry that profits by selling insecurity and then selling the cure. But modern beauty culture at least generally frames the expense as aspirational rather than moral. Nobody's arguing in a courtroom that your inability to afford a particular skincare routine proves something about your character. In Athens, that argument didn't need to be made explicitly. It was just how the system worked, which is worth remembering the next time somebody tells you that ancient philosophy operated on some higher, purer plane than modern commerce. Kalos Kagathos was underneath the Platonic dialogues, and the marble temples also a very effective mechanism for making sure that wealth looked like virtue, and virtue looked like wealth, so thoroughly fused together that separating the two required more philosophical effort than anyone in Athens particularly wanted to spend. Because wealth isn't only measured by what you earn, it's measured by what you get to keep, including, in Athens, the ability to keep your face looking like it belonged to someone worth believing. We have spent considerable time on the philosophy and the male body, and I am aware of what the title of this video promised. We are going there now. But the reason we have spent this time on the foundations is that without them, the female beauty standards sound merely strange. With them, they sound like exactly what they are. The logical conclusion of a set of beliefs about beauty, virtue, gender, and power that produce something genuinely unlike anything the modern world has to offer. The unibrow will seem straightforward by the end of this section. Let's start with where Greek women actually lived. In Athens, the city for which the most detailed records survive, respectable free women of citizen status were expected to spend most of their lives indoors, not occasionally indoors, not mostly indoors, inside, in the women's quarters of the household, typically at the back of the building or the upper floor, away from the public areas where male visitors might enter. They left the house for religious festivals, funerals, certain civic ceremonies, visits to female relatives. The carrying of water from the public fountain, a daily task that required leaving the house and was about as adventurous as their schedule typically got. There was no gymnasium, no agora, no philosophical discussions or legal proceedings or political assemblies. These were not spaces Greek women of citizen status were expected to occupy. The world was indoors. And this is absolutely essential for understanding the female beauty standard. Because a woman who spent her life primarily indoors, away from the sun, away from the physical outdoor labor that occupied both poor women and most men, would naturally develop a specific quality of skin, pale skin. And pale skin was one of the most significant female beauty markers of the classical period. Not because paleness was inherently beautiful, because paleness was evidence that you were the kind of woman who stayed indoors, that you were protected from the sun by the walls of a house that kept you from public life, that you had a husband or father with enough resources to maintain a household in which you did not need to work outdoors. Pale skin on a Greek woman was a class marker expressed as a beauty standard. Dark skin indicated outdoor labor. Outdoor labor indicated poverty or low status. Poverty and low status were, in the Kalos Kagathos framework, moral deficiencies. The woman with dark skin was not simply poor. She was, in the Greek sense, less beautiful, less good. This is one of the aspects of Greek beauty culture that is most genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Not because a preference for pale skin is historically unique. Similar class-based preferences appear in many cultures across history, but because in the Greek framework the class preference was given a philosophical foundation. It wasn't just a prejudice. It was a perception. It was kalos kagathos, applied to a woman's complexion. The beauty standard was a moral judgment applied to a characteristic entirely determined by social circumstance. Now, the white lead, because pale skin had to be maintained and enhanced, and the tools available for that enhancement were not entirely safe. White lead, lead carbonate, ground to a fine powder mixed with water or oil, was applied as a cosmetic to lighten the skin. This was not a fringe practice. The evidence from medical writers, comic poets making jokes about it, moralists complaining about it, and the actual archaeological remains of small ceramic cosmetic pots found in women's graves, all of it suggests that white lead was in common use among Greek women who could afford it. White lead is, of course, toxic. Chronic exposure to lead absorbed through the skin causes neurological damage, kidney damage, reproductive damage, and eventual death. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include, and this is where it becomes genuinely grim, pallor. The cosmetic produced the very effect it was supposed to simulate, through the mechanism of destroying the body being decorated. Ancient physicians noted the effects. Some warned against excessive use. The warnings did not stop the practice. Because the beauty standard did not stop requiring the outcome the practice produced, this is not vanity in the casual sense. This is what happens when a beauty standard is also a social requirement. When failing to meet it means appearing in public as someone who has not made herself presentable, as someone whose household is poorly maintained, as someone who is, in the most fundamental Greek sense, less good. The cosmetic was a social obligation, and the obligation was potentially lethal. The body ideal followed a similar logic. The ideal Greek female body was not thin. This needs to be said clearly, because modern Western culture, which draws heavily on what it imagines classical beauty to look like, tends to project its own preferences backwards onto the ancient world. The ideal was full, rounded hips, full breasts, a substantial body that signaled adequate nutrition, physical health, and the specific fertility that Greek culture associated with the primary purpose of a citizen woman's life, bearing legitimate children for her husband's household. Thinness in a woman, as in a man, was associated with illness or poverty. Neither was beautiful. A thin woman was a woman whose body was not doing what a woman's body was supposed to signal: health, fertility, the capacity for the specific biological and domestic contribution Greek society required. The goddess Aphrodite, the divine embodiment of female beauty, was not depicted as thin. The Aphrodite of Knidos, carved by Praxiteles in the 4th century BCE and considered by ancient critics to be the most beautiful sculpture ever made, depicts a woman with full hips, a rounded belly, and an overall physicality that would not be considered ideal by most modern fashion standards. She was ideal, by every measure Greek aesthetic theory applied. The modern world has invented a beauty standard and then looked at ancient Greek art and assumed the ancients agreed with us. They did not agree with us. They would have found our thin ideal baffling at best, and more likely a sign of poverty or illness. Now, the most revealing standard. The ideal beautiful Greek woman was not supposed to be seen, not primarily, not in the way a beautiful Greek man was supposed to be seen. Publicly, in the gymnasium and the agora and the assembly, in all the spaces where male Greek beauty was displayed and assessed and celebrated. The beauty of the ideal Greek woman was private beauty, beauty witnessed primarily by her husband, beauty that was more beautiful because fewer people had seen it. There was a concept, sophrosyne, usually translated as modesty or self-restraint or temperance. It was central to the female beauty standard in a way that had no real equivalent in the male standard. A beautiful woman who was modest, who did not draw attention to herself in public, who remained within the domestic space considered appropriate for her, was more beautiful than a woman with identical physical features who was less modest. The modesty was part of the beauty, the restraint was part of the beauty. The not being seen was part of the beauty, and here is what this means, stated plainly. The Greek female beauty standard was not really a standard about what women's bodies look like. It was a standard about what women's lives look like. A beautiful woman was a woman who lived in a specific way, indoors, modestly, in service to her husband's household, producing children and managing domestic affairs, and not troubling the public world with her presence. The pale skin was evidence she was staying indoors. The full body was evidence she was eating well at home. The elaborate hair was evidence she had time to arrange it. The modesty was evidence she was not going anywhere. The beauty standard was a behavioral standard in physical disguise. And the women who lived under it, who applied the toxic white lead every morning, who stayed indoors to maintain the pallor, who managed their appearance according to a system that was underneath its aesthetic surface, a system for managing their entire existence, were participating in something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. They were performing their own containment, not because they were foolish or unaware. Because the system was so thoroughly embedded in the culture, so completely justified by the philosophical framework they had grown up inside, so thoroughly normalized by the fact that every woman they knew was doing the same thing. That participation was simply what being a woman in ancient Greece meant. There was no outside of it from which to see it as a choice rather than a truth. That is, of all the things on this list, the one that is most genuinely worth thinking about before you go to sleep, not the unibrow, not the white lead, the completeness of the system. the way it reached all the way down into what a woman's life looked like and called that beautiful. Before we go to hair, you need to know that everything we just covered was true for one Greek city and almost entirely false for another. Because there was a version of Greece that looked at the entire indoor, pale-skinned, modestly hidden female ideal we just spent 20 minutes building, and rejected nearly all of it, Sparta. Imagine you are a girl born in Spartan territory in the 5th century BCE. Your Athenian counterpart 150 miles away is being raised for a life indoors behind walls, valued for staying unseen. You are being raised for something almost the opposite. You run. Publicly, in a short tunic slit at the side that other Greeks found scandalous enough to give it a nickname, phanomrides, thigh showers, a term Athenian writers use the way a disapproving relative uses air quotes. You wrestle. You throw the javelin and the discus. You train alongside, not instead of alongside, the boys who will one day be soldiers, because Sparta's entire theory of the state ran on one uncomfortable premise: strong mothers produce strong sons, and a strong mother is not built by sitting in a dark room doing needlework. Plutarch, writing centuries later in his Life of Lycurgus, credits this regime to Sparta's semi-legendary lawgiver, and while modern historians treat Plutarch's account with real caution, he was writing for a Roman audience 500 years after the fact. Partly mythologizing an already mythologized city, the core outline is backed up by an earlier and more contemporary source. Xenophon, an Athenian who actually lived among the Spartans and wrote a treatise on their constitution, confirms that Spartan girls trained physically in ways his fellow Athenians considered borderline indecent. If an Athenian gymnasium was, as we said, an HR event waiting to happen, a Spartan girls' foot race was the actual civic curriculum. There was even a formal competition for it. At the sanctuary of Olympia, yes, that Olympia, an all-female foot race called the Heraia was held every 4 years, organized by a council of 16 women for unmarried girls competing in tiered age brackets, their hair loose. The ERs, running the stadium track shortened specifically for the event. It is one of the very few pieces of hard evidence we have for organized female athletics anywhere in the ancient Greek world, and while its exact Spartan connection is debated among scholars, the practice sits comfortably next to everything else we know about how differently Spartan womanhood was built. Naturally, everyone else in Greece thought this was appalling. Athenian comic poets mocked Spartan women as loud, sun-browned, and man-crazy. The philosopher Aristotle, never shy about an opinion, criticized Spartan women in the politics for having too much freedom and too much influence over property, blaming it, with real seriousness, for what he considered Sparta's political decline. A culture that had built an entire moral philosophy on female invisibility looked at a culture where women ran races in public and concluded that this was clearly what was wrong with Sparta. Notice what this does to the pale skin standard we just spent an entire section building. A Spartan girl training outdoors under the same Mediterranean sun that made an Athenian wife's skin the color of unbaked pottery could not possibly maintain the same pallor. Sun-touched skin, evidence of a life spent moving rather than concealed, was not read by Spartans as a mark of poverty the way it was in Athens. It was read as evidence of exactly the kind of rigorous physical discipline Sparta prized in everyone, regardless of sex. Same word. Kalos kagathos. Same underlying belief that the visible body reveals the invisible character. Completely different verdict on what a virtuous body was supposed to look like, because Sparta had decided that a woman's virtue lay in producing and raising Spartan soldiers, and a body built for that job needed to look capable, not concealed. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it is easy to hear the Greeks believe beauty was virtue, and imagine one uniform ancient standard handed down from a mountain somewhere, obeyed identically from Sicily to Ionia. It wasn't uniform, it was a shared operating system running two very different pieces of software. Athens optimized for containment, Sparta optimized for output. Neither city doubted for a second that the body was telling the truth about the soul inside it. They simply disagreed about which truth the body was supposed to tell, and Spartan men had their own beauty ritual, every bit as codified as the Athenian one, and considerably more unsettling in context. Herodotus, writing his histories a generation or two after the fact, describes a Persian scout riding out before the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE to observe the vastly outnumbered Spartan force guarding the pass. He reports back to King Xerxes that the Spartans are calmly combing their long hair. Xerxes is confused. He consults an exiled Spartan king traveling with his court, who explains that this is what Spartans do before they expect to die. They groom themselves carefully, deliberately, as a way of meeting death looking their best. Modern historians treat Herodotus with the appropriate grain of salt he generally deserves. He was as much a storyteller as a historian, and the anecdote serves his narrative purposes a little too neatly. Though whether or not that exact hairbrush moment happened at that exact pass, the underlying custom it describes, is corroborated elsewhere. Long hair was a genuine sanctioned marker of Spartan male citizen status, groomed with real ritual seriousness. Worn specifically by full citizens rather than the helot underclass, Sparta enslaved to work its land, which means the single most famous last stand in Greek military history was according to the sources that shaped how the ancient world remembered it, preceded by several hundred men taking a moment to make sure their hair looked good before dying, somewhere between grim and admirable, possibly both. Hair in ancient Greece was not a personal style choice, it was a communication system. The specific way a person wore their hair, its length, its color, its arrangement, whether it was bound or loose, whether it was covered or uncovered, communicated information about their social status, their life circumstances, and their moral condition in ways that every Greek viewer could read immediately and accurately. Hair was a social text. Long hair on free women of citizen status was the standard, not casually long, elaborately long. Grown out, oiled, combed, carefully arranged, pinned up in the complex styles depicted in Greek art. The elaborate hairstyle was, like the pale skin, a status marker. It took time. Time spent on the hair was time not spent on physical labor. A woman with well-maintained, elaborate hair was a woman who had the leisure to maintain it. Slaves, by contrast, typically wore their hair short, not always by preference. Short hair on a woman in ancient Greece was a marker of slavery or mourning, the two conditions that removed a woman from the normal social order and required a visible external signal of that removal. A slave's shorn hair was a permanent visual marker of her status, readable from across a room. A free woman who cut her hair short was in mourning, the physical removal of something cherished as an expression of loss, the deliberate diminishment of one's own beauty as a reflection of internal devastation. Hair was given to grief the way it was given to gods, which tells you everything you need to know about what hair meant. Male hair told a different story. The significant marker for men was the beard. A bearded man was a man, not merely an adult male, but a man in the full Greek sense of the word, a citizen, a person who had passed through youth and arrived at mature masculine virtue. The beard was not just a sign of age, it was a sign of the specific transformation that age produced. The movement from the smooth-faced beauty of adolescence to the bearded beauty of mature masculinity, with all the authority and civic competence that carried. A man who could not grow a beard was a man whose body had failed to complete the expected transformation. This was not just aesthetically unfortunate. The Spartans, whose beauty standards were in several respects more extreme than those of other Greek cities, had laws governing the beard. Required to shave the upper lip, no mustache, but required to maintain the beard. The specific combination of bearded chin and shaved upper lip was a Spartan military aesthetic considered both practical and beautiful. The beard was expected, its absence was noticed and recorded. Hair, we just established, told you whether a woman standing in front of you was free, enslaved, or grieving. It did not tell you whether she was a wife. Because there was a category of woman in the Greek world who broke nearly every rule we have described so far, and Greek society built an entire separate set of expectations to deal with her, the hetaira. Not simply a prostitute. Greek had a separate, blunter word for that, porna, describing women, often enslaved, who worked at the bottom of the sex trade with no independence and no social standing. A hetera was something else, an educated, often foreign-born companion who attended the symposium, the all-male drinking party that was the center of elite Athenian social and intellectual life, and who was allowed to do there exactly what a citizen wife was never allowed to do anywhere: be seen, be witty, be present in the room where the philosophy happened. Aspasia of Miletus is the name that survives best. Partner of Pericles, the dominant Athenian statesman of the 5th century BCE, Aspasia is credited by multiple ancient sources with running a household that doubled as an intellectual salon. Plato and the Menexenus has Socrates' claim, with a straight face that scholars still argue about, that Aspasia personally taught him rhetoric. Whether that particular anecdote is genuine reporting or Platonic irony is a live debate. What isn't debated is that a foreign-born woman without citizen status was, by every surviving account, present in rooms and conversations that the wife of an equivalent Athenian citizen would never have been permitted to enter. The beauty standard didn't disappear for her. It inverted. A citizen wife's beauty was valuable specifically because so few people saw it. A hetera's beauty was valuable specifically because it was displayed, discussed, and, put plainly, monetized. She dressed in the fine, nearly transparent linen imported from the island of Amorgos that comic poets love joking about. She wore her hair in elaborate styles built to be looked at rather than concealed under a veil. She could use cosmetics as freely and inventively as fashion allowed, because unlike a wife whose reputation depended on restraint, a hetera's income depended on being remembered. Which brings us to Phryne. Phryne of Thespiae was, by the account of nearly every ancient writer who mentions her, the most celebrated hetera of the 4th century BCE, and according to the later compiler Athenaeus, the model for the sculptor Praxiteles Aphrodite of Knidos. The same full-bodied statue we already told you was considered by ancient critics to be the most beautiful thing ever carved from marble. Sit with that for a second. The Greek world's single most influential image of ideal female beauty, publicly displayed, endlessly copied, worshipped as a cult object in its own shrine, was, according to ancient tradition, modeled on a working courtesan whose actual profession made her the opposite of the sequestered unseen wife that same beauty standard was supposedly describing. The system, once again, was not bothered by its own contradiction. A wife's beauty proved she stayed home. A hetaira's identical beauty displayed publicly for payment proved something entirely different, and Greek culture simply held both conclusions at once without feeling the need to reconcile them, because Phryne was not a citizen and therefore existed legally and morally outside the framework built for citizen women. Then Phryne was charged with impiety, a serious capital charge in Athens, and put on trial. Her defender, the orator Hyperides, mounted what later writers describe as an unusual defense. According to Athenaeus, when his argument seemed to be failing, Hyperides tore open Phryne's robe in front of the jury, exposing her body, and the jurors, reportedly moved by what they were looking at, acquitted her. Modern historians treat the story with appropriate skepticism. It reads suspiciously like the kind of anecdote later writers loved repeating regardless of whether it happened exactly that way. But true or embellished, its survival tells you something the trial itself doesn't need to have literally happened to prove. Beauty, in the Athenian imagination, was not just character evidence in the abstract sense we described earlier. It was, at least in this story, treated as evidence you could physically present to a jury and expect it to function as an argument. A closing statement that consists of removing Exhibit A's clothing is not, by any modern legal standard, a defense. In Athens, as this story was told and retold for centuries, it was apparently a winning one. We have covered faces, bodies, and hair. And we have not yet addressed something that modern beauty culture barely discusses at all, but that the ancient Greeks considered a central component of physical attractiveness: smell. Specifically, the smell of olive oil on the body after exercise. Every man who exercised at the gymnasium oiled his body before beginning. Not a light application, a thorough covering of the entire body surface that would be exposed during exercise, which was all of it. The oil was applied by the exerciser himself, or by a professional assistant called an elliptes, whose specific function was the oiling of athletes. A skilled elliptes knew how much oil to apply, where, and in what order, and was not a minor figure in the gymnasium economy. After exercise, the oil and sweat were scraped off with the strigil, the material that came off. The combination of oil, sweat, and skin was called gloios, and gloios was considered medically valuable. Ancient physicians prescribed it for various conditions. It was collected from the bodies of athletic champions and sold, apparently at considerable prices, as a substance with specific healing properties. If you told a modern person that the sweat scraped off the bodies of gym-goers was being sold as medicine, the response would be some version of, "Please don't." But in ancient Athens, the body of a trained, healthy man was considered to be producing something of genuine worth. The specific smell of olive oil on a man's body, combined with the exertion of exercise and the particular quality of Mediterranean sun and wind, was, for ancient Greeks, a recognized component of physical attractiveness, not in spite of being the smell of exertion. Because of it, because that smell was evidence of a man who had been at the gymnasium, who had been doing the daily work of maintaining his body in the state Greek culture required of virtuous men. Evidence of discipline, of participation in the central institution of Greek male life, of the specific kind of physical seriousness that the kalos kagathos principle associated with moral seriousness. The smell was beautiful for the same reason the proportions were beautiful, because it was good. Today we spend significant effort and money ensuring that exercise leaves no olfactory evidence on our persons. The deodorant industry is built around the complete removal of this evidence. You can cycle 40 kilometers and emerge smelling of alpine meadows and mild confidence. The ancient Greeks would have considered this suspicious. You were supposed to smell like you had been working. It meant you were virtuous. Expleter us. It's worth pausing on exactly how systematic that reading of a face was supposed to be, because the Greeks did not stop at a vague sense that ugly people seemed untrustworthy. They wrote a manual. It's called the Physiognomonica, and for most of history it circulated under Aristotle's name, bound into his collected works. Modern scholars now generally believe it wasn't written by Aristotle himself, but by a student or later member of his school. The authorship question doesn't really matter here, because what matters is that this text was read, and for close to 2,000 years, as authoritative Aristotelian science. Its method was straightforward, and it will sound, to a modern ear, less like philosophy and more like a very confident zodiac. Compare the human face and body to animals. Find the resemblance. Read the character. A face structured like a lion's, heavy brow, broad features indicated courage because lions were courageous. A face with small, close-set features suggested a small, mean character. Eyes that darted indicated a suspicious or cowardly nature, on the logic that hunted animals dart their eyes to watch for predators. The text works methodically through nose shapes, forehead heights, gaits, even voices, cross-referencing each against an animal it resembled and the temperament that animal was assumed to have. This was not read as poetry. It was read as diagnostic science applied by real people to real decisions. Physiognomic reasoning shows up in the practical world in ways that should sound uncomfortably familiar. Slave traders in the Greek and later Roman world were advised in surviving handbooks to examine a prospective purchaser's physical features for signs of temperament before buying, the ancient equivalent of judging a job candidate's competence from a headshot, except it was written down, taught, and treated as expertise rather than instinct. Orators structured courtroom speeches around an opponent's appearance, confident that jurors were already primed to read a face the way the physiognomonica taught them to. And this is where the Socrates problem, which we set aside a while ago, comes back to bite the whole system one more time. Socrates. Flat nose, bulging eyes, thick lips, the face ancient writers uniformly describe as ugly by every Greek measure, was, according to the exact animal comparison logic the physiognomic tradition relied on, a walking argument against his own wisdom. Ancient physiognomic writers specifically associated his features with coarseness, appetite, and a lack of self-control. Several ancient sources report that a physiognomist named Zopyrus examining Socrates' face without knowing whose it was is said to have declared him stupid and sensual, and that Socrates, hearing the verdict, reportedly agreed with the diagnosis but added that he had used philosophy to overcome what his face predicted about him, which is either the most gracious concession in the history of ancient anecdote or the cleanest possible proof that even the Greeks half suspected their own system had a flaw in it. Either way, the flaw did not retire the system. Physiognomy remained a respected, cited, practically applied field for centuries after Socrates' death, surviving into the Roman world and well beyond it, because a codified teachable method for reading strangers' moral worth off their faces at a glance was, whatever its accuracy, an extremely useful tool for a society organized around hierarchies of citizen and foreigner, free and enslaved, trustworthy and not. Kalos kagathos was the belief. The physiognomonica was the instruction manual, and it is worth pausing on just how literally that instruction manual was used. Because the modern temptation is to read the physiognomonica as a curiosity, an ancient oddity produced by a pre-scientific world that didn't yet know better, and to assume that educated Greeks treated it with the mild skepticism that we, from our superior position several thousand years later, would naturally bring to a system that reads moral character off nose shape. They did not treat it with mild skepticism. The text was cited, taught, expanded, and applied across contexts with the same seriousness that a modern professional might apply the diagnostic criteria in a clinical manual. Medical writers in the Hippocratic tradition used physiognomic reasoning alongside other diagnostic tools. Rhetoricians incorporated it into their theory of persuasion, how to read an audience, how to present yourself, how to assess an opponent's reliability before he'd said a word. Military commanders in the later classical and Hellenistic periods were advised to consider the physiognomic profile of soldiers when assigning roles. Men whose features suggested boldness to the front, men whose features suggested caution to positions where caution served best. The system was genuinely believed to work because it had a coherent internal logic that was difficult to disprove. If you assigned your boldest-faced soldiers to the vanguard and they fought well, that confirmed the system. If a soldier with a cautious face performed poorly under pressure, that confirmed the system. And if the predictions failed, if the lion-faced man turned out to be a coward, if the small-featured man turned out to be generous, there was always an available explanation. The soul struggled against the body. Philosophy could override the face. The reading had been correct. The subject had simply exerted unusual effort in defiance of his natural baseline. A theory that confirms itself from its own failures is, of course, not a theory in any meaningful scientific sense, but it is an extremely durable one. The Roman world inherited the physiognomonica along with the rest of Aristotelian learning and ran with it. The first-century Roman author Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars, consistently describes the physical appearance of emperors in terms that map directly onto physiognomic analysis. Augustus's clear, bright eyes and composed expression as evidence of divine favor and excellent character. Caligula's hollow temples, thin neck, and sunken eyes as legible signs of the instability that would define his reign. Suetonius was not simply describing, he was reading. His readers knew how to interpret the signals because they had been trained by the same tradition that produced the physiognomonica. Nero's description in Suetonius is worth a moment's attention. a body going soft despite theatrical training, dull eyes, poor skin, a neck thick with fat, protruding belly, thin legs. Every feature is physiognomically legible, and none of it is flattering. Suetonius wrote after Nero's reign ended badly, which made the unflattering physical reading a retrospective confirmation of everything the system promised. The body had always been telling the truth, you just had to know how to read it. The fact that Suetonius wrote the verdict after the emperor was already dead and widely condemned did not, apparently, strike anyone in his readership as undermining the objectivity of the assessment. What the tradition ultimately produced, after centuries of use, adaptation, and confident misapplication, was a habit of mind rather than a specific text. The Physiognomonica as a book went through phases of obscurity and rediscovery, but the underlying practice of reading moral character off physical features never really left the educated Western tradition. It reappears strikingly systematized in the work of the 18th century Swiss pastor Johann Caspar Lavater, whose Physiognomische Fragmente, published in 4 volumes between 1775 and 1778, attempted a complete scientific revival of face reading, and was read by, among others, Goethe, who was briefly enthusiastic before becoming deeply skeptical, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who reportedly requested that potential subordinates be assessed physiognomically before appointment. That is, 2,000 years of unbroken belief in the readable face. From Aristotle's school in 4th century BCE Athens to a French emperor consulting face charts before giving someone a promotion. The ancient Greeks did not invent a prejudice that later ages outgrew. They systematized a belief that later ages kept finding reasons to rediscover. We have covered the philosophy, the standards for men and women, the hair, and the smell. We have not yet covered the part of this story the most popular accounts quietly leave out. What happened to people who didn't meet the standard, not just socially, not just in terms of whom they could marry or how people spoke to them, in terms of the law, in terms of whether they could participate in the civic life of the democracy, in terms of what their physical appearance officially said about their worth as a human being in a society that had written that assessment into its philosophical foundations? The logical consequence of believing that beauty and virtue are the same thing is this: ugly people are bad people, not probably bad, not statistically more likely to have bad tendencies. Bad. The ugliness is the evidence. The evidence is visible. The conclusion is available to anyone with functioning eyes. This was not an implication the Greeks drew reluctantly. It was a standard feature of their social life, expressed openly in literature, philosophy, and legal practice, treated as a perception rather than a prejudice, a form of social wisdom rather than a form of injustice. In Greek comedy, the plays of Aristophanes and the later tradition, physical ugliness was a reliable marker of moral failing. The villain was ugly, the fool was ugly, the coward was ugly. The playwright didn't need to explain that the ugly character was bad. The ugliness explained itself. The audience already knew how to read the signal. In the law courts of Athens, the most sophisticated legal system in the ancient world, invented by the people who also invented democracy, physical appearance was used as a form of evidence. Legal speeches sometimes reference the appearance of the accused or the accuser as a factor in assessing their character and the credibility of their testimony. A man whose appearance suggested virtue was a man whose word carried more weight. A man whose appearance suggested deficiency was a man whose character was already in question before he opened his mouth. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics discusses physical beauty in relation to human flourishing, eudaimonia, in terms that make it clear that serious physical disadvantage is a genuine obstacle to a good life, not just socially, as a disadvantage imposed by the prejudices of others. Constitutively, a person who is seriously ugly is, in Aristotle's framework, missing something that full human flourishing requires. The ugliness is not a social problem, it is a real deficiency. Now, sit with that for a moment. The most sophisticated philosophical tradition in the ancient world, the tradition that produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that formed the intellectual foundation of Western thought for 2,000 years, contained at its core the belief that an ugly face was evidence of a deficient soul, not as a fringe position, as mainstream philosophy, and the practical consequences of that belief, the way it operated in legal proceedings and political assessments, in the daily social interactions of Greek civic life, were real and often severe for the people whose faces did not match the standard. This is the thing that makes Greek beauty culture more than an interesting historical curiosity. It is a system. A complete system, philosophically grounded, mathematically specified, socially enforced, reaching from the ideal proportions of a temple pediment all the way down to whether your word was believed in court. A system in which your face was not just your face, it was the verdict on your character, visible to everyone, delivering its judgment every time you walked into a room. In 1406 BCE, Roman legions destroyed Corinth, and Greece, as an independent political power, effectively ceased to exist. Rome did not destroy the philosophy that came with it. The famous line from the Roman poet Horace, That captive Greece took her rough conqueror captive is usually quoted about literature and art. It applies just as precisely to the mirror. Roman elites imported Greek tutors, Greek statues, Greek medical texts, and, without ever quite admitting they were doing it, the entire kalos kagathos framework underneath Greek beauty culture. The white lead that was quietly killing Athenian women a few centuries earlier didn't stay in Athens. It crossed the Adriatic under a new name, Cerussa, and Roman women adopted it with the same enthusiasm and the same slow poisoning. The poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BCE, produced an actual technical manual on the subject, Medicamina Faciae Feminae, a guide to skincare and cosmetic recipes for Roman women, discussing exactly the kind of skin-whitening preparations the Athenians had been applying for 200 years. Rome's most fashionable love poet moonlighting as a beauty columnist tells you how deeply the underlying belief had traveled, not just the practice of whitening skin but the assumption underneath it, that a woman's face was a surface worth this much careful technical attention because it was read as a statement about her. The satirist Juvenal, a generation or two later, mocked elite Roman women for the sheer labor of their morning cosmetic routines, a target he clearly expected his readers to recognize instantly, which tells you the practice wasn't a curiosity by his time. It was the culturally dominant, faintly absurd, universally understood ritual of the wealthy Roman household, precisely the way it had been the culturally dominant ritual of the wealthy Athenian household 4 centuries earlier. Roman law courts inherited the habit too. Cicero, the greatest orator Rome produced, was perfectly comfortable referencing an opponent's physical appearance as part of a character attack in his speeches, the same move Athenian orators had been making for centuries. Transplanted into Latin with none of the original Greek philosophical scaffolding attached because by the time Rome adopted the habit nobody needed to cite kalos kagathos explicitly anymore. The belief had stopped needing its own name. It had just become how you argued a case. Rome adapted some of the specifics. Roman male beauty culture, less organized around naked public gymnasium life than the Greek version, migrated instead into the culture of the baths, the thermae, vast public bathing complexes where similar rituals of oiling, scraping, and social display played out clothed in steam instead of olive dust. The proportions changed a little. The underlying grammar didn't. A body was still a document, a face was still a verdict. Rome simply carried the mirror across the sea and kept looking into it, and by the time the Roman Empire itself had risen and fallen and scattered its libraries and its laws across the whole of Europe, the belief that beauty and virtue were the same thing had been copied into enough languages, enough legal systems, and enough unquestioned cultural instincts that nobody needed to remember where it started. Even the specific philosophical justification survived the trip more intact than you'd expect. Roman writers on rhetoric and ethics, Cicero among them in his treatise on moral duties, De Officiis, continued to describe physical dignity and moral seriousness as visibly connected, echoing the kalos kagathos logic without necessarily citing the Greek phrase itself. The vocabulary had gone quiet. The assumption underneath it was still running exactly as designed, just now stamped SPQR instead of inscribed in the Ionic dialect, which brings us back to where we began. The woman we started with, sitting at her bronze mirror in the half-light before sunrise, applying the white lead, extending her brows into one careful, unbroken line, was not trying to impress anyone. She was complying. With a system so thoroughly embedded in every layer of her culture that compliance was not experienced as a choice. It was experienced as getting ready. The unibrow, the pale skin, the full body, the modesty, the indoor life. None of these were preferences. They were a single coherent set of requirements expressing a single coherent belief that how you looked was who you were, that who you were was visible to anyone paying attention, and that the only appropriate response to this situation was to present the correct surface. The Greeks looked at the human face and saw a text. We have spent considerable effort over the past several centuries trying to convince ourselves that the text doesn't say anything, that the face is just a face, that the surface doesn't indicate the depth, that beauty is subjective and virtue is something else entirely. We have not entirely succeeded. The beauty industry still sells the idea that looking a certain way makes you more credible, more trustworthy, more worth listening to. Politics still rewards physical presentation. Courtrooms still respond to appearance. Philosophers stopped writing the physiognomonica, but the hiring manager who glances at a candidate's photo before reading their CV is running the same software on older hardware, and the software has never issued a patch. The kalos kagathos principle was never abolished. It just stopped being taught in philosophy classes. The woman at her mirror is 2,500 years away from you, but the mirror is still there. Let that sit with you as you drift off.